I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be joined by Nikolai Tolstoy, who is a historian, an author, and the head of the historic and noble Tolstoy family. Welcome to the show, Nikolai.
Hello, thank you very much.
It's really, really good to have you on the show. And you've written many, many books over your life, and some of them are well known. You've written The Minister and the Massacres, Stalin's Vengeance, The Secret Betrayal, Victims of Yalta, and also that was on the aftermath of the Second World War. But you've also written The Mysteries of Stonehenge and other books about other topics. So there's a lot to read and a lot to learn from you. I know that some of these books have been censored. And, we like free speech on this channel. Can you tell us about, why did some people try to censor some of what was in your books before?
Well, my first book, Victims of Yalta, the first book on the subject of sending back all these poor people to Stalin at the end of the war, was received huge acclaim, and I was made Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and so on and so forth. But my research inevitably was such a huge subject, and including interviewing hundreds of eyewitnesses, focused on Harold Macmillan, who apparently gave the secret order. So I then wrote the book, The Minister and the Massacres. And then finally I was sued by the chief of staff there, who'd risen to being chairman of the Conservative Party and a peer. He sued me for libel, and I won't go into there's not space now to go into all the details, but the trial was, by every account, very much biased by the judge, who was a neighbor of the chap. And right. So then after that, I was more or less banned. And one of the things that bewildered me, and I'd mentioned in my books, was that I wrote that half this material I need to know what really happened is in the Soviet archives, and I assume they'll never be seen. Well, when Yeltsin came to power, Solzhenitsyn persuaded him to help me, so much so that Yeltsin invited me to Moscow, where I was allowed to see all the secret archives, even going to the Lubyanka. And they gave me photocopies of all of them, and I took them away. And they showed that I was absolutely right down to the last detail. Sometimes things were actually worse than I'd guessed. And so I then wrote another book, but pointing with all this, well, you'd think it's a big enough subject and a dramatic enough discovery. But suddenly, no British publisher dared publish the book, though before that I'd been a best-selling author. I think I received something like £250,000 for my previous book, but suddenly, no, I wasn't a proper author at all. So it had to be published in the United States, where censorship is banned under the Constitution. And it was. But of course, the censorship is pretty effective in that no British newspaper dared review the book, even though it's available in England. But at the same time, they're scared stiff of me because I violated the court injunction not to discuss the subject in public, but they daren't endorse that. So I'm in a very strange position of being in a sort of limbo. But I keep writing. And
yeah. Well, I'm glad you do keep writing. I mean, this is extraordinary, isn't it? Because what you said was true. And it's not like what you said was false or, you'd said anything that was wrong. You were actually bringing truth and hidden facts to the public. I mean, I would think that anyone who says that they believe in free speech, and all of these government ministers and all political parties in the UK always go on about, we believe in freedom and democracy and free speech. But then you have them trying to stop you from saying something and bringing something to the public which they want covered up. I mean, do you think this happens more often than we know about?
I think it must. It can't be unique to me, but on the other hand, I think they're careful not to sort of put out all their censorship because they don't, above all, don't want it known. So it's a very cunning sort of censorship, affected partly by the courts, then by threat of an injunction, which goes on forever. And most of these things are unique to my case. Well, I hope they are, but It's not healthy. And of course, if they can get away with it in this case, with I have a lot of public support, I would say most of the public support me on this, and including very distinguished public figures. But the government, even though this government, of course, has nothing whatever to do with it, but they feel, I think, even if Harold Macmillan is shown to have been a war criminal, which he clearly was, then where does the Tory party as a whole stand? But of course, as no one will tell me, I can only guess.
Mm. Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? But what just quickly, what I mean, I don't know if you can say, but what were the main things that they didn't want people to know in your books?
They didn't want to know that we handed over, Britain did, over 1 million people between 1944 and 47 to Stalin, many of whom were slaughtered on arrival. And actually, British officers whom I interviewed saw this happening when they were on the ships taking them back through the Black Sea. And and people quite rightly go on about the slave trade. Well, this was a slave trade, the biggest slave deal in the 100 years of slavery crossing the Atlantic, but to happen within 3 years, it was, and it's a crime which is simply not allowed to be discussed, unless, of course, you say it wasn't a crime, then you could.
Well, I mean, this is not taught to people in schools, but I guess this is the UK government and people in the in politics, very, very powerful people in the UK didn't want their reputations to be tarnished, which, you know, this is not something that's unique to the 40s and 50s. It's going on today as well.
Oh, yes. That's what's so strange. I mean, that it is still continuing. And what's more, they don't want me to publish books on other subjects, nothing to do with it, because, for instance, I've just completed a book on King Arthur and showing whether there was a real King Arthur or not. You'd think this would be nothing to do with politics at all. But, of course, if I'm shown to be a good historian and a respectful one who pursues the sources and so forth, then, hey, wait a minute, may he not have been right about the repatriation? So I have to say that this censorship could not happen, for example, in the United States, because, as I mentioned, the Constitution forbids censorship of this sort. So it's dangerous because we don't know what else, as I think you were suggesting, we don't know what else is said. By the nature of things, if it's censored, you don't know it exists.
Exactly. You know, in the United States, of course, they got the First Amendment, which is an absolute right to freedom of speech. But, you know, I was involved in politics well, I am involved in politics. What I was going to say is I was elected. I was on the London Assembly for 5 years. And there were always, you know, we had debates about freedom of speech and human rights. And the answer I got back was always, oh, well, freedom of speech is a qualified right here in the UK. It's not an absolute right. Like it is, yeah. So they use that, you know, that sort of semantic term in order to censor you if they want. It's dreadful. But look, I'll just move on here because I'm very interested to hear your take on relations between the West and Russia. Obviously, you're from the Tolstoy family, which is, you know, a noble Russian family, but you grew up in England. So I mean, yeah. What I mean, it all seems to have gotten wrong in relations with the West and Russia. But sorry, what were you going to say? You were just going to say something about...
No, sorry. I was just going to say that my father escaped from Russia after the revolution. And so, as you say, I was born in England. But I have Russian citizenship as well as British. So I feel very strongly about these things. And, of course, I feel Russian too, as well as British. I have to. But I'm not happy with what's going on at the moment at all. I think I was originally, when Putin annexed the Crimea, I have to admit I supported that because Crimea has never been part of Ukraine historically. But what has completely changed my mind is simply the totally barbaric actions of the Soviet Union. I mean, like to take just one instance, the murder of Navalny. So I'm afraid of this. I always opposed the Soviet regime, of course, and this to me is simply another example of the Soviet regime at work. And Putin, of course, himself was a KGB officer. So
I probably would have a different. I might have a different opinion on that myself. I
of
know,
course,
obviously, you're very embedded, being both English and Russian, and
yes.
I respect your views. I mean, I would sort of see perhaps that what's happening in Ukraine is a response to it didn't. It's not something that started in 2022. It goes back to 2014 and beyond, where the West actually overthrew Yanukovych with the revolution, put in Poroshenko in Ukraine, and then Zelensky in order to bring Ukraine into the EU and into NATO, and that crossed some of Putin's red lines. I mean, so that's a little bit more to add to the picture. I mean, what do you think about that as that argument?
Well, I'm interested because it's precisely the argument I myself endorsed in the initial stages. And as I say, with the absorption of the Crimea, I did support it at the time, and I think I rate supporting it. But simply the barbaric behavior of what I'm afraid one can only call the Red Army and its attacks on civilians and so forth. I can't accept that, and I don't think it's unpatriotic. For example, if I'd been alive or in 1919, I would have joined the Finns or the Balts or the Poles in opposing Bolshevism, and I feel I'm still a Russian patriot. And again, in 1956, when I was a student and a very hot-blooded, I think, I was in Dublin, but I flew to London to volunteer to fight for the Hungarians in their uprising. So I don't think it's unpatriotic. And indeed, the other day, a very good friend of mine, a Russian former Soviet citizen who's now a professor at Stanford in USA, said to me, it's very, very sad. He said, of course, Ukraine is going to be very badly damaged or even crippled, but it is Russia that will eventually suffer. And of course, it's true. Russia's now dependent on China and Iran and so on for weaponry, and it's up a blind alley, which is doing them no good at all.
I would have a different opinion on that again myself. I might just, say, well, I would maybe look at, we'll look at what, you get from Western media outlets, but I also look at what you get from, Putin Direct and RT and Russian outlets. Obviously, they give two completely different views of what's going on. And the West has imposed sanctions on Russia, but Russia doesn't seem to be doing too badly. In fact, it seems to have hurt the West more than Russia, because gas supplies have been turned off. The Nord Stream pipeline has been blown up. You've got Seymour Hersh, world-renowned investigative journalist, pointing the finger at Norway and America for doing that. And it seems that oil prices, gas prices, energy prices have gone through the roof in the West. The values of our currencies are going down, but Russia doesn't seem to be doing too badly because it's got all the resources that it needs itself. And it's found new markets in China. And, obviously there are 3 billion people living in China, India, Southeast Asia. So it's got plenty of people to sell goods to. So I would just, obviously you've got your opinion. I'm just putting that to you. Is that,
yes.
Something you can, Russians probably might not see it in the same way.
No, I think what you're saying, you've got a valid point there. Quite what the effect is on Russia, we don't really know. And as you say, we hear such differing opinions. And I'm sure some businesses are doing well and being not dependent on foreign materials which have been embargoed. It makes Russia have to develop its own. On the other hand, there's been an appalling export of brain power of intellectuals leaving the country. And that's something that goes way back in Soviet history. I think it was 1924 that Lenin simply kicked out 2,000 intellectuals from the country just for being intellectuals. Well, of course, not only was it Russia's loss, it was the West's gain. I mean, where would the helicopter be if Sikorsky hadn't had to flee from Russia to go to the United States? And one could multiply that. Well, why
Absolutely,
am
yeah,
I?
very, very well. Obviously, the most widely used helicopter that we have in the world. Yeah, indeed, indeed, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so much, and culturally too, many of the greatest people culturally, Rachmaninoff and so on, had to
Mm,
flee from Russia, and that's been going on ever since. So I think
mm,
if this war toppled the Soviet or quasi-Soviet, neo-Soviet government in Russia, of course, then a benefit would come out of it. But who knows? We can't. That I don't pretend to prophesy the future.
No, I know some people do want to do that. I mean, I went on a talk show with Piers Morgan, who I don't particularly like, a couple of years ago, and he actually said to me he wanted regime change. He wanted to get rid of Putin, and that's what some people think. I mean, personally, I think we shouldn't be interfering, and you know, something that does concern me, what the UK is doing, is David Cameron has pledged that he's now going to give £3 billion a year in weapons and financial aid to Ukraine. I mean, what do you make of that? Should we be giving money to Zelensky, or should we be trying to de-escalate the situation?
Well, I don't think we can de-escalate it. Otherwise, the Red Army, as I fear it still is, will simply, the Baltic states and Finland and Poland will be next on the list. After all, there's no particular rationale for this invasion of Ukraine. Formally agreed by Putin's predecessors that Ukraine was now henceforth an independent country. So that being the case, it wasn't an independent. It's never really existed as an independent country until, but it was. It's been formally recognised, so I really can't see any justification. But as going back to what you were saying about Cameron and regime change, well, I frankly don't think there's anything we can do about that.
Right. Yeah.
Even if it changes, we might get some. I don't think we'll get anyone worse, but
Indeed. Yeah. Well, there we go. Yeah.
Get someone just as bad.
Well, yeah, I think. Well, we're coming to the end. Sorry, Nikolai. We're coming to the end of the show now. We're going to come to the hard end of the show soon. But thank you so much for joining me. You know, we agree certainly on many things. We might not agree on some things, but it's really good to have you on the show, and so everyone can hear your opinions. Lovely. Thank you for coming on.